And I'm happy to invite to the stage the moderator, Suleyman Mamutov, who is a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I think I will invite other panelist speakers first before opening. And the distinguished speakers, you're very welcome. Refat Chubarov, Refat Mohammed Hassan, Natia Navruzov, Marina Slesarenko-Barreto, and one more participant will join us online, Cristine Takuá. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion, the title of which challenges for the indigenous peoples worldwide. Can we build solidarity and achieve justice? A warm welcome to our distinguished speakers once again. This discussion is an opportunity to learn from the experiences across the world. Just before we started, I had an opportunity to have a short conversation with our panelists, and we exchanged this interesting thought about the fact that during all the sessions of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, more than 90% of participants, and there are many participants each year, talk about survival only. And almost never a single word is said about development, which demonstrates that despite all the details of colonization and oppression against indigenous peoples worldwide, irrespective of the region where you live, the story is quite similar. The same story of dispossession of lands, the repressive policies targeting the very existence of indigenous peoples and their cultural identities. The story of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people, Karaites and Krimchaks, is also about the same. The very story of the illegal 2014 occupation is about vanishing and destroying and non-recognizing their right to self-determination, because no one and perpetrator in the first place did not ever ask the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, the only one who have the right to self-determination, whether they agree or not. And this is just one of the puzzles in the picture, which is worldwide, as I thought, is really very similar. I will start with, to begin, I will start with a short icebreaker. I will ask you to answer in a couple of words, or maybe one sentence, before we proceed to the general, to the main questions. What is the main challenge for your indigenous people or indigenous peoples in the country you live? Please, Natia, you start.
Thank you very much. I would like just to start by, expressing my gratitude for being here. Thank you so much for the organizers for having me. I'm Natia Navruzov. I work in Iraq. I have been working there for the past 6 years with an NGO called Yazda, and I'm a member of the Yazidi community. I was also born in Georgia, so I feel very, very close to what's happening here in Ukraine, and the past days have been really eye-opening for me in terms of your resilience and everything that you're doing. So to answer your question, as you just said, I think when I saw your question, the first thing that came to my mind is that Yazidis are, there's a real threat of extinction of the Yazidi community, We are around 1.5 million in the world, scattered everywhere. There are a few here in Ukraine as well. I don't have the statistics, but I know of that. I have family who lives here. And recently we were subjected to a genocide by the Islamic State, ISIS, also known as Daesh. And I'll tell you more about that in a bit.
Thank you. Refat, якщо можна в одному.
So, Mr. Refat, in 1 or 2 sentences, if you could please say, what is the biggest challenge for the Crimean Tatar people? It is clear that for the Crimean Tatar people and other indigenous people, there are many challenges, but you asked me to respond in 1 sentence. The main challenge for the Crimean Tatar people is the repossession of Crimean Tatar land by the Russian enemy, which systemically destroys Crimean Tatar people and has been destroying throughout 240 years. So the main challenge is the grab of our land, which leads to our destruction. Thank you, Refat. And Mohammed?
Elaborate what is the biggest challenge for indigenous peoples in Sudan and in Darfur region in general.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for giving me opportunity today to be with you in beautiful city of Kiev. My name is Mohammed Hassan. I'm from 4th tribe and from Darfur region. My challenge as from the indigenous people facing in Darfur regions, justice and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
From the other mics. So, hello, I am Marina Slesarenko-Barreto. I come from Brazil, but my family comes from Ukraine, so I'm very happy to be here, also because of my personal history. I feel very humbled and honored, especially to be here, because as I said in my panel yesterday, I think what you've been doing here is radical democratic revolution. And I know that humanity failed a lot of revolutions. You know it better than I do, but I think what's ongoing here is very radical and democratic and revolutionary. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. If I had to pick one struggle, should I say that I'm a researcher or something?
I will do this after.
Okay.
If you want, you can.
No. I'm just going to stick to the struggle. So, if I were to point just one struggle, I think the indigenous people in Brazil probably better than I am to say about this, and we're counting on indigenous leaders to come here to talk to us. But from my researcher background, I'd point to the demarcation of land, which is a struggle that lasts for ages since Brazil was colonized, and it's still ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for pointing a mistake that I made. I would like to introduce speakers a little bit more than just their names. So first, I would like to present to you Natia Navruzov. She is an executive director of NGO Yazda, a lawyer and a representative of Yazidi people, Iraq. Refat Chubarov, the chair of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar People, and the member of parliament of 2 convocations, or 3. Mohammed Hassan, he is an executive director of the Darfur Network for Human Rights, Sudan. And Marina Slesarenko-Barreto, researcher with the Law and Democracy Cluster at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning. She is a freelance political analyst, and the text I have says that it is both Brazil and Germany.
Yeah, I'm living in Germany right now.
Exactly. And the online participant, Cristine Takuá, she hails from the Maxakali people. She's a philosopher with a degree from UNESP, an educator. Cristine lives in the Rio Silveira village of Guarani people in São Paulo and teaches at the Indigenous State School, Chiro Barracuie. She represents her community at the Indigenous Education Center, the representative of São Paulo state villages at the National Conference on Indigenous Education, and the founder of the São Paulo State Indigenous Teachers Forum. And the first question will go to our distinguished speaker, Refat Chubarov. Refat, I will formulate it in Ukrainian.
The Crimean Tatar people have recurrently addressed this issue with their own capacity, but also attracting attention of international organizations and international community when it comes to seeking understanding, support, and some protection after the start of occupation in 2014. But what do you think have worked so far? And on the other part of the question, what are the major gaps when it comes to offering international support in favor of the Crimean Tatars and actually applying the capacity and function of those international organizations? Well, on that note, I'm afraid that I have too little time to tell you so much. With that in mind, please allow me, when it comes to certain particular phenomena, to limit. Okay, since the sirens are allowed, so what shall we do?
Check whether it is a nuclear weapon.
I hope not nuclear weapon. Yes, so now the ones who don't feel comfortable, you can go to the shelter, yes. But we can now continue, and we are monitoring the situation. And when there is the real danger, we will ask everyone to evacuate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Refat, please continue. Nothing new, just an ordinary siren alert. Будь ласка, продовжуйте. Наші організатори моніторять ситуацію. Якщо
Once again, organizers are monitoring the situation.
Nothing special, just an ordinary day in Ukraine. Thank you.
Отже, продовжуємо це.
Okay, indeed, these are realities of our time that all of us have to live in, not just surviving, but that also affects the indigenous people. And speaking of the situation in Ukraine, this relates to Crimean Tatars, Karayims, Krimchaks, whose land, I mean the Crimea, was captured, was occupied by the Russian Federation in 2014. And this is where Russian-Ukrainian war started, which now lasts for more than 10 years in a row. But with that, let me invite you to come back to the subject of our discussion, emphasizing that this is namely the war, Russian aggression against Ukraine, which has intensified the fact and the process for Ukrainian society to grow conscious of the importance of addressing the vital issues of indigenous people when it comes to restoration of the rights and freedoms of indigenous people, including Crimean Tatars, remembering that these people for over half a century were literally detained elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, having been exiled from their motherland. When we came back to our native land, and this coincided in history and time with Ukraine gaining its independence, there also were different historical periods of building our relationship with the with Ukraine as a country. There was some time when importance of restoring rights of indigenous people were neglected, and only in 2014, at the time when Crimea was actually seized, and also when the so-called referendum was conducted, then only Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine made a special resolution to guarantee the rights of Crimean Tatars to own their land, to live in their land as an indispensable element of Ukrainian territory, and also recognizing the Mejlis of Crimean Tatars as the representative authority, which is elected by the delegates of Kurultai among Crimean Tatars. And thus, Ukrainian parliament has declared about joining the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And ever since, we started our systemic efforts to restore the rights of Crimean Tatars, including those in Ukraine. But again, this is a sad fact to acknowledge, but we wasted 23 years within the period of Ukrainian independence, which we had at our disposal, and that was the time when most of the Crimean Tatars finally received an opportunity to come back from exile, which lasted for over half a century. So that is one important issue I'd like to emphasize. On the other hand, this return from exile, and similar to that, restoring the rights of Crimean Tatars is taking smooth progress. We do live in a democratic state. We have the parliament drafting and endorsing the laws, but there are different political factions, different opinions represented in that parliament. And we do understand that making respective decisions on behalf of the state is also a challenging process. But we decided to apply the following algorithm. First, we declare the law on indigenous nations in Ukraine, which will serve as foundation to start making other steps, to start building on that, to sustain the rights and freedoms for indigenous peoples. This law was approved in 2021, and it's fully compliant with all of the principles which are stipulated by the UN charters respectively. But, like any other country, sometimes between the time of approving the law in your parliament and the time when it's actually implemented in realities, there is a lot of time. And such implementation process, and particularly law enforcement, is also challenged by different processes and different actors in Ukraine. The same happened here in regard with this law on indigenous people, because there are some clauses which have not been fully implemented so far, like, for example, offering recognition of the status of indigenous people when it comes to representative authorities, which will serve for representation of interests of such people, just like this is stipulated by the Constitution of Ukraine, speaking of Crimean Tatars and Mejlis of Crimean Tatars. And this is not acceptable, because this is part of our current reality. And this is a shame for Ukrainian government, for Ukrainian parliament, for the Prime Minister to avoid implementation of the clause of the law which was approved by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. On the other hand, I have to be as objective as possible. And also, there are other areas which are covered by the same piece of legislation about indigenous nations. There is a very active ongoing collaboration between Mejlis and Ukrainian representative authorities, government authorities as well, and we are doing our best to implement them. And driving my remarks to this summary, we also run an active discussion about the future course of reforms. But I'd like also to take this opportunity to remind all of us some facts which are commonly known, but that is to see how the entire world is progressing towards resolution of the problems of indigenous people. Please take a look at any agenda of the UN Coordinating Authority in Affairs of Indigenous People, which is a standing forum of United Nations, which was established in 2000, and this year they had their 23rd session of that standing forum. And looking to the agenda of that forum, we can see that with every year, indigenous people and their representatives are making sure that their voice is clear and loud in order to formulate the importance of respecting their fundamental rights, such as self-determination, such as the right to own their land, as the right to own and manage their resources, as well as other areas of their performance that would allow them not only to survive, but also to flourish. And again, this year, when 23rd session of the UN Standing Forum on Indigenous Nations took place, the key discussion was about strengthening the right of indigenous people for self-determination in the context of UN Declaration about the right of indigenous people, and also attracting attention about the role and place of young people in that process. And I have to admit that the United Nations organization makes a very clear example, a pattern for sovereign governments to replicate. Because soon after the 23rd session, the ecocide session had an emergency meeting, and they have published an institutional report about the performance of this session 23. And in the resolution of ecocide, it was declared that session 24, to take place next year, will also include the item for discussion implementation progress of the UN Declaration about the indigenous people within the United Nations organizations and systems, including some of the fundamental solutions to the above-mentioned challenges. So please be invited to monitor closely this agenda and its implementation, because 2025 is coming soon enough, and different countries will have to report to the United Nations whether or not they're actually supporting, protecting, and allowing indigenous people to fully enjoy their rights, freedoms, and capacity. But coming back to the same session 23 of the Standing Forum, a lot of our discussions were informed by the evidence and the evidence generated in research, including the Tove Saul Dalganto, which was one of the key researchers, Suleyman Mamutov, our moderator today, and Valentina Sovkina, when it comes to managing principles for indigenous people, self-management, and autonomy implementation. So this could be a quite helpful piece of reading. Please refer to the original source, because results of that research provide very helpful orientation when it comes to learning different details. And to finish, let me recite a couple of summary notes described in this document, and clearly providing us with the guidance where to focus our efforts and also the importance of cooperation between different indigenous nations, because we do have a lot of common features that we share, and we do understand there were certain mechanisms applied to deprive us of our right and freedom by the colonizers, by the occupiers in the different parts of the world. So, looking into some of those key findings of this research, let me refer to the following. Indigenous people across the entire world, the autonomy is not only a political ideal, but the necessity. They are facing the huge number of problems which are threatening their existence, including marginalization, criminalizations, deprivation of property, and quality of life and environment. And despite those problems, the indigenous people are manifesting miraculous resilience in restoring their capacity by means of reinstating autonomy, although sometimes they do not have the respective organizational structures and institutions to reinforce that. And looking from that perspective at the history of Crimean Tatars, at least the recent 100 years of its history, this is exactly which was happening. Speaking of algorithms, although it was not so clearly described in the international law. Yes, I know that time is precious and I have to drive my remarks short, but I'd like to finish by stating that in fight for our rights, we also have to be guided by such principles as collaboration between our countries whenever possible. Speaking of Ukrainian situation, let me assure you that this is absolutely possible because we do have democratic mechanisms not only in place but also in action. We have to align our vision of common strategic goals and equally important, another fundamental principles for us to abide by in cooperation between representatives of different indigenous people to build associations, relationship, making sure our voice is clear and stronger together at the international stage. And on that note, I would like to cordially thank organizers of this esteemed forum for providing us with such an opportunity to join such discussions not only regarding our rights and opportunities, but at the same time enjoying this opportunity to meet each other and to share experience, to learn from experience of each other, and to join our efforts for the sake of common success.
Ну, по-перше,
Thank you so much. Thank you. For me personally, it was unexpected that Refat Aga read a paragraph from a research that was co-written by me. So thank you. And I appreciate that Refat Aga mentioned the importance of democratic institutes, democratic institutions in this state. Indeed, it affects the success of the dialogue and even the mere availability of the dialogue. Because when an indigenous nation lives in a non-democratic society, then there's a whole set of key problems, starting with non-recognition and inability to start the dialogue. So I am aware that the mere fact that I can discuss the rights of indigenous peoples with the diplomats and governmental delegations and the indigenous people have autonomy, the mere fact of discussion already is valuable. Of course, we would like to have even more effectiveness, but dialogue is the prerequisite in the relationship between the governments and indigenous peoples in any region. Now, I would like to give the floor to our online participant, Ms. Cristine Takuá. Thank you so much for speaking to us from nature, from outside. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for finding the possibility to be with us. My question is, the primeval forest of Brazil is one of the most threatened biomes on the planet, and the indigenous people living there, they face unique challenges and problems. Could you please share how the worsening of the habitat of the Atlantic primeval forest affects the rights of the nations and affects the environment in which you live. Thank you.
Or
I was told that there is only Ukrainian Portuguese translation.
oh,
Sure, thanks. Please, the floor is yours.
Bom dia a todos. Eu agradeço muito o convite.
Good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate the invitation and thank you for being here. Today I am in Ribeiro Severa, in the middle of the Atlantic forest on the beach of São Paulo state. And I'm happy that I can tell you about our struggle and our resistance. In Brazil, there are over 300 ethnic groups which have been living here for more than 500 years. So the matters of these indigenous people are handled by a state agency in Brazil which tries to protect the rights of the indigenous people. However, we see a lot of violations of the rights of these people. We see the violations in land rights and violations in cultural rights. For example, the agriculture. We see land grabbing, how the territories of the tribes are being grabbed, and we become detached from our forest, and this directly affects our life, our usual mode of life, our philosophy, our spiritual nature, because it's closely linked to the forest. So for us, it's not just a home, it's a deep, deep connection with all the animals, with all the living beings, with the plants here, and with the resources. We see them as spirits, spirits you see, spirits you don't see, which live in harmony. So when we protect this territory, we protect them, we protect our home. That is why our spiritual leaders, for centuries already, have been asking to give us strength so that the forest would respect us and give us the possibility to live here for the sake of our children. I am a mother, I am a midwife, I am a teacher also, and I see how we all take part in this struggle. I believe that we people, we have to spread this wisdom everywhere, because these are the principles outlining our life. These are the principles that enable us to develop in link with nature. In Brazil now, we're living through a difficult political period, and we see that now we do not have the open dialogue. We cannot openly discuss environmental matters. We cannot openly discuss the rights of indigenous people. This is ecocide, unfortunately, the ecocide which we experience, but the government is not recognizing it as such. But sadly, it's been happening for several years. The rivers are contaminated, forests are contaminated. So what do we do? For centuries, we continue living like this, and we simply observe how large territories are being destroyed. The Atlantic forest, we call it Niara, the territory where the holy spirits live. And this is the territory, this is the forest which our colonizers commodify. They do not treat it as something living, they treat it as the commodity that can be sold.
Uma tinta
But for us, all these resources, all this water, it's living, it's like a living being. So the colonization of Brazil started with the tree, the so-called Brazilian tree, the red tree. For the colonizers, they looked at that tree as the source of pigment. But for us, the tree is holy. The trees, the rocks, the plants, we all consider them as something sacred, something holy. So now we think that it's time to reunite, with nature. So our ethnic groups, Maxakali, my ethnic group, and others, there are over 300 ethnic groups in Brazil. We must be vocal. We must continue talking about the necessity to restore our rights. We must keep speaking that unfortunately we cannot eat money. We need forests to have food and to protect us. This is important. It's important to understand this, and we need to have dialogues with our government, states government and federal government of Brazil. There should be a ministry of indigenous people, which would include the representatives of indigenous people. And besides that, there are many other matters like the agriculture, resource extraction, which violates our rights and affect our territories directly. They affect our lives directly. Today in Brazil, there is a law on delineation of land of indigenous people, which provides for the status of indigenous lands. And we know that our strength is so our effort, our daily effort is aimed at the protection of these territories. We want our children to play in clean water, to fish in clean water, so that all the animals, the lynxes, the bees, the birds, all the living beings would be able to live in their territory, in the Atlantic forest, on the lands of our ancestors, in the holy land for us. So, as a teacher, I work in schools which we call the living schools. We have research cycles, and we work in cooperation with other peoples, other ethnic groups. It's important to do this in Brazil. And through this work, we want to show that this respect is important for all of us. This can be the direction for our development. I would like to say that while we all fight for the respect to our rights and to our lands, this has to be taught in all educational facilities. Here in Brazil, we created a lot of museums of indigenous peoples, where we show our society about us, and we managed to bring our culture closer to the society, at least in the state of São Paulo. And we would encourage all the public in Brazil and all the world to know more about indigenous peoples in Brazil and about our daily effort and daily struggle. The struggle against these crimes, the environmental crimes. Because when you kill a river, when you kill a mountain, you kill a part of humanity. So we, humans, we have our rights and we have our duties, duty to respect life, the life of rivers, of rocks, of mountains, of trees, of living beings. I would like to conclude by saying that our struggle, which we continue from our grandparents, it doesn't stop. We continue singing our song, our prayer. I would like to sing a little bit to welcome the sun. And I would like to wish you a good conference. And I want all the indigenous peoples all over the world to unite, to come together for the sake of respect of our lives.
Nyamandu miri oguatama nyanemopu aijewu nyanemopu aijewu pawe injawu aiyawu pawe injawu aiyawu pawe Nyamandu mirim ao sol, e nós todos os dias devemos.
Yamandu is the movement of our sun in the sky, and we welcome our sun because every day it comes up, it gives us warmth, and it gives us life. Thank you once again for giving us this opportunity to tell about our nation, about our cause. It's very important, Cristine, that indigenous nations, even though they sometimes have their lands shrinking and oppressed by the others, but they are the most effective protectors of nature, in particular in Brazil. And I remember some wise words from a representative of an indigenous nation, which I heard in the forum. When all the rivers are dried, the majority will understand that you cannot drink money. Cristine's words were also resonant with that. So,
if you may. So your NGO is a global community-led institution that protects all minority and indigenous groups in Kurdistan region, Iraq and Syria. And just recently, in August this year, the world commemorated the 10th anniversary of a horrible event, the genocide of Yazidi people by the Islamic State. When Yazidi people was subjected to mass killings, displacing, capturing men, women, boys, girls. What lessons can be drawn from this experience for indigenous Yazidi people, and how do you seek justice after these mass atrocities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so it was already said a little bit, but I think one of the main lessons learned that we have seen being targeted by ISIS is that as a minority, as indigenous people, you need to be visible, you need to be loud. And I think it's in our DNA to hide, because this is also one of the reasons we survived, right, all this time. But when something like that happens in the 21st century, where the world is connected, it's very important to be loud. So you said a few words. I just want to give a little bit of background. So as I mentioned previously, the Yazidi community is a very small population, around 1.5 million in the world. Our roots come from the ancient Mesopotamia, and we believe that our calendar is more than 6,000 years old. We have a religion, which is the Yazidi religion. In our original language, we call ourselves Yazidi, not Yazidi. That's something that the international community labeled us with. But we believe in one God and angels, throughout the history, unfortunately, our faith was really misunderstood by the different majority religions, including Christians, Muslims, and very early on we were labeled as devil worshippers. Yazidis, even until today, by some communities are seen as devil worshippers and are being persecuted. And this is one of the justifications ISIS used when they attacked us in Iraq. I don't think I need to explain who ISIS is. They have committed crimes in many different parts of the world. They were very strong from 2013, took territory in Syria and then expanded to Iraq. So when ISIS was at the door of Sinjar, which is the homeland of the Yazidis in northern Iraq, Yazidis, for most of them, frankly, didn't really know what ISIS wanted. They thought it was maybe just a political group, just looking to take the power. Iraq is quite an unstable country, so they thought it's just that. But some Yazidis actually knew that ISIS was planning something, and actually ISIS was planning a genocidal campaign. So they tried to escape. They tried to leave Sinjar and find shelter in Kurdistan. You mentioned Kurdistan. Kurdistan is an autonomous region in Iraq that is very close to Sinjar. Unfortunately, the armed forces that were protecting Sinjar at that time, so de facto it was the Kurdish Peshmergas, they did not allow Yazidis to flee. They actually told them, you don't need to go, you're safe, we will take care of you. In the night to the 3rd of August 2014, ISIS arrived from Mosul, Tel Afar. They had seized Mosul 2 months before. It's the second biggest city of Iraq, so they also got weapons there, and they came. I think what people don't know much is that external force that came from the outside. Of course, a lot of them came from Syria. Later, foreign fighters joined from over 80 countries, joined ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But the initial attacks on the Yazidis of Sinjar were committed by the neighbors. Like it often happens in genocides, the perpetrators are often the people closest to you. So a lot of the neighbors of the Arab tribes joined ISIS and helped to commit that genocide. So you described the crimes a little bit. So it was recognized as a genocide very early because, first of all, it was said in ISIS propaganda. ISIS was not hiding the fact that they wanted to destroy the Yazidis, but also in the way the crimes were committed. Women were separated from men. Men who were deemed too old to be brainwashed and militarized were systematically killed. So ISIS left behind over 90 mass graves in Sinjar. 30 of them are still not exhumed to this date. A lot of families are still waiting also for identification. And as you also said, they enslaved the women and the children. And I think this is where the media really put attention on, and sometimes in a too wrong way, I would say, is the sexual slavery that ISIS subjected the Yazidis to. The women and girls specifically were sexually abused, raped, and trafficked from one ISIS member to the other. The young boys who were not killed were militarized, as I said. They were trained to hate their Yazidi faith, to forget their Yazidi identity, and they were made the so-called cubs of the caliphate. So this is what happened. So imagine this happens to your community, you're a very small community. Frankly, like most of the Yazidis in Sinjar didn't even have access to education. There's no university in Sinjar. I was at that time living in France. I'm a Yazidi, as I said, from Georgia. I don't really have any family, from what I know, in Iraq, but I heard about all of this in the media. And this is the first time, even for some of my friends, that they heard about Yazidis in August 2014, while the genocide was happening. And I will never forget how one of the first questions the mainstream media was asking was, but who are the Yazidis? You know, instead of asking, how can we save them? They're actually being genocided right now. When ISIS came and encircled Sinjar, a lot of Yazidis also went on Sinjar mountain in the heat of August without food, water, and they were encircled for many days like that, and a lot of Yazidis died on the mountain. The international community was wondering, okay, who are they? You know, do they deserve our attention? It was very, very distressing. So what some Yazidis in the US did, so there's a huge Yazidi diaspora in the US. That's because when the US invaded Iraq, a lot of Yazidis were hired as interpreters, so later with special visas they could migrate to the US. So they had connections with the Pentagon, with the White House, and they went, the first thing they did, they protested. They said, you need to do something, like our people are being killed, we're receiving phone calls, like we know that they're being run out, taken to different places. So the US reacted a few days later. President Obama made a speech, and he's actually the first world leader that said 4 days after the attacks that this might be a genocide that is happening right now. So the airstrikes started, and a safe corridor was opened to help the Yazidis stuck on Sinjar mountain. But unfortunately, we lost 7,000 people, and within a few days they were killed, and over 6,000 were taken into captivity. This is how Yazda was created, the NGO I work for. So, we were literally established 3 weeks after the start of the genocide. So, again, we had no idea about what is an NGO, what is advocacy, what is human rights, what can the international law order even offer us as mechanisms. So, I was a lawyer, I was studying international business law because I thought, okay, that's interesting, that's what my university offers. But, like many Yazidis at that time, my sort of plan completely shifted. So I started to look into human rights, I joined Yazda, I moved to Iraq, and I started to help my people. And one of the main lessons learned, and I'm sure Mohammed will also mention that, is the importance of documentation. When no one cares, one thing that you really need to do is to collect the evidence. Because until people start to care, the evidence is usually vanished. Either people are killed or the perpetrator is destroying the evidence. So it's very, very important to document the evidence. So one of the first projects we started is a documentation project. I was leading it for like 4 or 5 years before I became the executive director of Yazda, and it's still until now one of our core projects. So with that evidence, with survivors starting to come back from captivity, some of the survivors accepted to speak about what has happened to them. And again, you need to think, this is a Middle Eastern culture. Yazidi, and I'm part of this community, is still a very patriarchal culture. You don't speak about sexual violence, you don't speak about rape, and you don't speak about forcible conversions. So it was really, really groundbreaking that Yazidi women actually started to speak about that. And one of them in particular, Nadia Murad, you might have heard of her. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 with Dr. Denis Mukwege. They received it together. And I don't know, should I just continue?
This is the end of the cares.
And this Nobel Peace Prize was another way for us to get attention. And again, when I think about it, it's also, it shows another flaw in the system, right? Why would you wait for survivors to be the ones speaking up and then get a Nobel Peace Prize, which is a very prominent, prize to give attention to a community? So, but this is how it was. So, what we did in terms of, trying to get justice is that we naively thought in the beginning that because ISIS is an international recognized terrorist group, right, committing crimes everywhere, More than 80 nationalities compose ISIS. We thought convincing the international community to give us justice would be easy. And one of the first steps we did is to go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So in 2015, we submitted a submission to the ICC. We asked them to open an investigation. And what we were told is, your evidence is not enough focused on high to mid-level perpetrators. Iraq is not a state country, a state party to the ICC. Syria is not a state party, so the ICC door was closed very quickly. Then we asked for a tribunal. You know, like Ukraine is also asking for a special tribunal right now. We said, okay, you're not giving us ICC, then give us a tribunal, because again, more than 80 nationalities are composing ISIS. This is the opportunity to create such a tribunal to bring the justice to the survivors. Again, we were told no. We were told, and this is also how the international order is shifting, there's no appetite anymore, and as Ukraine is experiencing as well, to create such international mechanisms, we are asked to go to the national system. But in Iraq, unfortunately, there is still no law that criminalizes genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, even 10 years after the genocide. And Iraq itself needs support, it needs capacity building. The judges, prosecutors, lawyers don't know how to bring forward a genocide case. So again, Iraq was not an option, ICC was not an option, no international tribunal. The two things we got is, one, the creation of a UN mechanism called UNITAD to document the crimes. So the Security Council sent a UN team to Iraq to document the crimes in 2000. They started in 2018, and they were operating until 2 months ago. And that's another huge lesson learned. 2 months ago, they were closed, without any plan on what would happen to all the evidence they have been collecting for the past 6 years. According to UN procedures, when you close a mechanism like that, a copy of the evidence goes to New York, to the UN headquarters. But then what? UNITAD interviewed hundreds of survivors, raised expectations of thousands of people, not just from the Yazidi community. They were also interviewing Christians, Shabak, Turkmens, Kakais, other minorities that were targeted in Iraq. To collect evidence, spent, I think, over $200 million were spent on UNITAD to put that evidence in an archive. So I think in the Ukrainian context, with any fact-finding mission, any mechanism that is created, it's very important to ask, okay, what will happen once that mechanism closes? And I know there is a debate for a long time now in the international area that there should be a standing mechanism that receives all evidence whenever a mechanism closes and can continue to use it. So right now we are advocating for this evidence to be accessible, and it's very, very difficult. And then the second thing, and this is where we had to be creative to get justice, was universal jurisdiction cases. So Iraq was not an avenue. We went and started to knock on the doors of different countries, and I know Ukraine is doing that right now as well. So the only country until today to have prosecuted ISIS members for international crimes is Germany. In Germany, we had 9 cases so far, so 9 cases in 10 years. It's really not that much. And among these 9 cases, we had 3 genocide convictions. And all of these cases were possible because our NGO and others, of course, brought evidence, brought the survivors to Germany, helped them to participate. But imagine, you're a Yazidi survivor, you grew up in Iraq, you were subjected to a genocide, and to get justice, you need to travel thousands of kilometers to a system that you don't speak the language, you don't understand the culture, just to get justice. So again, the system is deeply, deeply flawed. So yeah, I think just to conclude, I think what I learned over the past years, and I always also tell my team, is that when you are subjected to a genocide, your natural response is survival, but it's also, this is so unjust that for sure we will be helped. And I think Ukraine feels like that as well. Unfortunately, we see that the system is deeply flawed, that we need to rely on ourselves, mainly, pushing others to help us. So it's very important to invest in the youth, to build their capacity. And again, this is, I told always my team that as well, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. dealing with the consequences of the genocide will never be done in our lifetimes. This is generational trauma, this is generational issues we will transmit, but what is important is to lay solid foundations and to make sure that the next generation are able to pick up on something we left. And this documentation work that we have been doing, collecting 3,000 statements, so much evidence, is something we will pass on to the next generations.
Thank you so much, Natia, for your speech and for your arguments. I fully, and for pointing about this intergenerational trauma, and for stressing how important is it to collect evidence to document the violations. Ukraine learned it the first-hand experience when it was justice in the International Court of Justice in Hague to recognize the ban of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar People by Russia as a discrimination, which was a quite complicated case, and the issue of evidences also was raised numerous times during this case. Thank you again. Now I'm going to Mohammed Hassan. Your organization, Darfur Network for Human Rights, uses the grassroots system of monitors to systematically and actively collect reports about the violations of human rights. And the Darfur region has faced grave human rights violations. How does this intersect with the rights of indigenous peoples in Darfur, and what justice or response mechanisms are the most urgently needed and crucial now? Thank you.
Okay, thank you again for the opportunity. As I mentioned, Darfur population above 7 million, and in 2003, when the war started, this conflict affected 2,000 villages. From this time, those villages, most of the 2 million civilians displacement to the camp. Up to now, 2023, populations became increasing. So, our indigenous people in Darfur our life is really very dangerous. So in 2009, the former regime governments, they not allowed any NGOs to come to inside to make service to the people in the camp. So, mechanism about justice for indigenous people of Darfur, particularly, we need to address the historical, marginalizing, protection, our culture, and land right. It is including recognize our indigeneity. So the human rights violations in Darfur, it is still going up, still going on. It's deeply in Darfur, indigenous people and marginalized people, it is systemic discrimination of the conflicts and communities, and this displacement, they lost a hope of the people, of indigenous people. I want to come to the question of how the mechanism of the justice. We have case in ICC, case of Darfur in 2003. But the international justice, actually, the indigenous people, not in Darfur, around the world, the indigenous people, they still the marginalized. So, we need accountability for war crimes and ethnic targeting. And also we need to rebuild our resources. And also we need including the participation of the indigenous people process for the justice. And also one of challenge, rehabilitation and liberation of the indigenous people. This is one of challenge. Me from Darfur, the war since 2003 and up to now, almost 20 years or 21 years. We live in a suffering situation. People live in the camps without education, without health care, without food. And also, 20 years, generation lost their indigenous land or indigenous village. For example, I have my brother who was born in 2004. Now, his age 21 years. We came in the camps in 2003. What do you think about this generation who was born in 2004 and 20 years live in the camps? So this is one of challenge of the indigenous people. The role of the indigenous people to ensure the accountability. Indigenous people, it's not victims, but it is initially agent of the change and to play role and reaction to ensure that justice and accountability to be through. We are organization of the Darfur Network of Human Rights. We training, we documenting violation. With the indigenous community. So this documentation of violation, the indigenous people who is the witness of the crime, and it is easy can give you more information. And also to training and empowerment to document how to collect information and how to contribute legal cases. Also we do advocacy and awareness. Indigenous people to share their experience. Like for example, yesterday I saw one of the survivor is another side of the events. The ladies under 18, they address us make testimony about when 15 years, Russia occupied, and then finally she studied in Russia, finally escaped come to his original home. So this is very important. Because when the indigenous people share experience and for the local or international, immediately give action, reaction, or give intention to the what's going on and what's happening for these indigenous people. Transitional justice system. Indigenous people practice even to including conflict and reconciliation. This is to receive or to resource for the approach for justice. And community mobilization. Grassroots community movement with the indigenous community can pressure both international and national to take body action for the accountability.
I apologize.
I want to mention what indigenous people need support. One, training indigenous people to technical and legal, and especially indigenous people of human rights defender. This must training those people. Their awareness as they can advocate about the indigenous people. Also, platform indigenous people voice for peace process, for transitional justice and framework. Policy to ensure that participation and governance and decision maker. So, if the empowerment of indigenous people initially is not for justice, but it is initially for the peace and security and democratic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you for underlining this important thing about indigenous peoples to be the agents of change and reminding us that indigenous peoples are often excluded from the peace-building processes and they should be involved. We're going to you, Maria. So in Brazil, indigenous peoples are at the forefront of the political repression and sometimes denial of their collective rights. And at the same time, they experience challenges due to the climate change issues. How do these pressures shape the struggle for their rights, and how did Brazil approach the issue of indigenous people's rights over time? Thank you. The floor is yours.
This is a very important question. To answer it, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work as a researcher in this center. We documented what was happening when Bolsonaro government was in power from 2019 to 2022. So we literally made a catalog of all violations we could find to democracy and for indigenous peoples. And this was very important to see, for us to see, because there we could spot a lot of disrespect for indigenous peoples and climate. So, and the forests, and so Christina was talking about this, like how we live together, we build communities, and things are not separate. We cannot see this as separate things. But for us, it was not obvious from the start that these things were together. And so in this work, we could see how there's this interplay between climate change and indigenous peoples, and how normally the global north, talking about indigenous people, don't pay attention to how things work together and how these issues have these relations. And now we're not in Bolsonaro government, luckily, anymore. And Lula is our new president. He started his third term of office in 2023. And one of the first things he did was to create a ministry for indigenous people. So at the institutional level, I would start saying that these was a very high, big conquer for indigenous peoples. Cristina was talking about Sônia Guajajara, which is a very popular leader for the indigenous struggles and movements in Brazil, and she's the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples since 2023. And what she's been carrying on is this agenda for pushing forward demarcation of land, and a recognition of indigenous people's memory and culture, and what's their impact on Brazil. So, because just for you to have a little glimpse of how violent it was during Bolsonaro government, one top high-rank official that became later the first Minister of Agriculture said that he would not demarcate even 1 centimeter of land for indigenous peoples. So it was really a nightmare, not only because of lack of demarcation of lands, but also we indigenous communities were obviously hugely struck by pandemic. All of us were, but they were particularly vulnerable. And this was actually, this became the ground for a case against Bolsonaro government in the permanent court of the people. He was condemned for the lack of transparency and for care for vulnerable communities in Brazil, originary communities, and among them the terrible work for amid indigenous peoples. But the problem is, it's not enough that we are in a progressive and inclusive government. It's not enough that we have now a ministry for indigenous peoples, because we know that the struggles are so hard that and the interests are so opposite sometimes. So Cristina was talking about this time frame, the thesis of the time frame. This is a very urgent issue in Brazil right now. What does it mean? In Portuguese, it's marco temporal, time frame in English. What does it mean is that there's a law that says that indigenous people have only right to the land if they were in this land at the time of the promulgation of our constitution, 1988. And that's obviously very violent, because a lot of indigenous people were displaced during the military dictatorship that happened in Brazil from 1964 to 1985. So they couldn't go back to their lands, obviously. And what this law says is that if they weren't there, they don't have the right to the land, as if they were not there from the start, from the time when Brazil was colonized by Portugal. Indigenous peoples were always there and were always taken away from their lands in very violent processes. So this law has been taken to the Federal Supreme Court, so that indigenous peoples and very active civil rights movements, they brought this charge to the court, saying that this law is unlawful and anti-constitutional. And the Federal Supreme Court has been sitting on this issue for ages, because we know that there's not only the right that indigenous people have to this land, there's also an opposite interest of agribusiness and very strong economic groups on the table. So this case started being judged in Bolsonaro government, and a lot of agribusiness sectors came to the hearing and said that we have to push economics, the economy forward, that we have to find reconciliation of interests, which means for them, reconciliation is simply putting indigenous people aside, simply ignoring their existence and their right to the land and their culture and their memory and their communities. And we're talking about 4 years right now. Bolsonaro is not in government for 2 years right now. This issue started being judged, if I'm not mistaken, 2021 in the Bolsonaro administration. We're talking about 2024, Lula government. This is still on the table. And I don't think that it's going to be judged very soon, because this is a very, there's huge fight on this issue. The Supreme Court, some of the justices won't take their stand with the originary communities, the indigenous peoples. Agribusiness is pushing very hard on the opposite direction, doing advocacy and a lot of backstage negotiations. So we don't know what's going to happen. And even if we have a ministry for indigenous people that says, no, we have to take this issue forward, we have to establish that indigenous people have their right to their land, and they are the community that made Brazil exist, we have very powerful interests on the other side, and they keep pushing for their agendas, not only in the Supreme Court, but also in the Congress. So I was talking, this is not enough. What we've been also experiencing in Lula administration is a very high rate of wildfires. I mean, I'm not saying here that it's all Lula's fault. He's also, the government has been trying to tackle this, but the center of Brazil, ecosystem called Cerrado, has been very targeted by these wildfires, and the government has been trying to tackle this issue, but this is not enough. We have to push forward, and it's not only the ecosystem that becomes endangered by these fires, it's also the communities that live there, the indigenous people that live there. And not only the indigenous people, we're talking about also about Quilombola people that are African communities, original, they're also, because this concept of originary communities is a broad concept. Obviously, we're talking about indigenous people, but not only. So Quilombola communities that come from Africa, we're talking about riverside communities that live along the coast. We're talking about gypsies. So there's also a lot of other minorities that we normally don't speak about. And they're also very endangered. So their ways of life are endangered. And it's not enough. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Due to the time restrictions we have, there will be no opportunity for you, unfortunately, to ask questions to our panelists. And I would like to wrap up by saying that indigenous peoples, despite they have very unique and different cultures, traditions, languages, as you could hear and see, they have quite similar problems and challenges worldwide. And first of all, they are people. And since we do not live in a George Orwell novel, Animal Farm, there can be no peoples of different qualities. They are still peoples, they have their rights, collective rights, they have the right to self-determination and autonomy. And if you ever asked yourself what you could do, what action you could take in order to support indigenous peoples, the first is recognition. The recognition of their distinction, of their unique histories and experiences, even if they are in minimum and smallest minority in any place where you live or which you visit. Thank you so much. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers. I'm Suleyman Mamutov, rapporteur of the Permanent Forum.